Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. This is our session tonight on the tariffs and condominiums and how that affects our economic economy, or our condo communities through the economy. Gosh, my words are all going together tonight. I apologize in advance. Thank goodness I don't have much to speak about. We're going to give a couple minutes until everyone is on, and then we will start. Please bear with us as this is our first time using a Zoom or not a Zoom platform, using a Teams platform. So we are a little bit learning on the go, but that's okay. We're flexible. We can make that happen. With me tonight is Caitlin. She's working the tech. Kathy graciously set up the meeting, and we have our panelists. We have Rob from Brick & Co. We have John from Armorco, and we have Stefan from Edison Engineering. So we'll give it a couple minutes. We'll do some introductions and we'll get this started. Thanks once again for attending. It'll just be a couple of moments. Thank you again, everyone, for your patience. It looks like our numbers have started to steady, so we're definitely going to get started. We do have an hour and a half on schedule, but if it doesn't take us that long, that's also okay. We really want to thank you for spending your evening with us. And we're excited to go and talk about this very relevant topic tonight. First off, I'd like to introduce you to the panel. We have John, the VP of Sales and Estimating with Armorco Solutions. Armorco Solutions is a great company who specifically service the condominium industry, which is pretty fantastic. We don't see a lot of that. They specialize in exterior high-rise and townhome restoration and interior common element refurbishment. John has been with Armorco for the last 25 years, and his experience in the condominium space has helped Armorco develop production processes and protocols that help managers and directors plan and execute large capital projects. John's construction background prior to joining Armorco was in the coatings and sealants sector. Thanks for joining us tonight, John. Also, we have Rob from Brick & Co. Rob has 40 plus years in the construction industry. I know no one believes that when they look at Rob because there's no way that's possible. Currently a senior managing partner at Brick & Company Restorations. His career commenced at Brick & Co. in 1994 and a partner in 1995. His responsibilities range from managing scheduling and project management, crew development, training. His area of expertise are definitely building envelope repairs, waterproofing, and sealing. One of his favorite roles is providing business repair solutions to clients. One of his least favorite roles, I think, is doing these speaking engagements. So we're super happy to have him here with us tonight as well. Thank you so much, Rob, for being here with us. And last but certainly not least, we have Stefan, the principal and regional lead with Edison Engineers right here at the Grand River office. As a professional engineer and building science specialist with over 15 years of experience in construction and condo-focused building restoration, he has also spent his career helping condo boards, owners, and managers tackle tough engineering and financial decisions with owners and managers alike, helping them grow confident in their decisions. He leads a team developing work in areas like reserve fund planning, structural, repairs, building envelope, and mechanical systems. He's also passionate about education, which is why we're super excited he's here with us tonight, and supporting condo communities. And he currently serves as the president of the Canadian Condominium Institute Grand River Chapter's Board of Directors. Yay! Thank you so much for being here with us, Stefan, a role I also did once and loved. So I'm really glad to see someone else in that role and enjoying it just as much. As most of you know, because if you're regular attendees, we often do an icebreaker. So the icebreaker for this session is I asked all of our panelists what their very first job was, and at the end we'll tell you who did which job. So on the panel today, we have someone who cut grass as their first job, someone who is a dishwasher as their first job, and someone who was an apprentice carpenter as their first job. So kind of write down your thoughts, and when we get through to the end tonight, we'll let you know who was who. So good luck with your guesses. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Stefan to start this great session going. Stefan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Casey. So we have an hour and a half, so I'll look forward to my hour here ahead of us. I, as Casey mentioned, like I love talking about this stuff and can talk for a long time. It's a very interesting time. There's certainly, the only thing that's certain is the uncertainty that we're all facing right now. And you're not alone as a corporation. You can rest assured all the corporations on this call throughout the region are facing the same or similar challenges to what you're facing. And it's not just the condo industry. So I want to read a little paragraph for you here. The major shift in direction of U.S. trade policy and the unpredictability of tariffs have increased uncertainty, diminished prospects for economic growth, and raised inflation expectations. Pervasive uncertainty makes it unusually challenging to project GDP growth and inflation in Canada and globally. Instead, the April Monetary Policy Report presents two scenarios that explore different paths for U.S. trade policy. In the first scenario, uncertainty is high, but tariffs are limited in scope. Canadian growth weakens temporarily, and inflation remains around the 2% target. In the second scenario, a protracted trade war causes Canada's economy to fall into recession this year, and inflation rises temporarily above 3% next year. Many other trade policy scenarios are possible. There is also an unusual degree about the economic outcomes within any scenario, since the magnitude and speed of the shift in U.S. trade policy are unprecedented. So that was the first paragraph of the April 16th Bank of Canada overnight rate announcement. So in preparing for this session, we received lots of questions. How do we handle this uncertainty? What impact is it going to have on our condo fees? Well, it's certainly interesting to us that the Bank of Canada doesn't know where all this is headed. And so there are no firm answers that we can give tonight, as I hope was the expectation. But this isn't the first time the economy has been changing. The economy is always changing. So, I haven't been around as long as Rob has, but I've been here in the industry through the implementation of the HST, which had a industry-wide impact on reserve fund studies. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly, overseas invasions have had more of an impact than maybe people realized, and now threats of trade war. So condos have been under this constant challenge of trying to manage that uncertainty. So what can we do? Well, we can look to trends and markets to try to gain some insight. And then all we can do is make the most informed decisions possible based on the information that's available to us. So where can we get that kind of information? There are two recent reports that I want to share. I'm actually going to share a screen here that I think provide some valuable insight for corporations. And these are publicly available. So if you want to take note of the names, please feel free to do so. The first is the Condominium Authority of Ontario's report on reserve fund study findings, and this is from 2024. And this report goes through a number of interesting items. What I wanted to highlight was this chart. And on this chart, they show BCPI and CPI. So when we're talking about reserve fund planning, forecasting what something is going to cost 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're making assumptions about that long-term inflation. But in the short term, look at the uncertainty that we've faced. So CPI is is consumer price inflation, or the consumer price index. And that's what you hear about in the news. That's what the Bank of Canada talks about. But in this higher purple number is the building construction price index, which tracks the construction industry. And so there's been a lot more volatility on the construction cost side, and Rob and John will be able to speak to that in more details for sure. But in the short term, we see there's this high volatility, right? This was through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll see what the future years from now will hold. That's the short-term lens. But what about long-term? Because when we're talking about reserve fund planning, we're not just looking at short-term and what's right in front of us. We need to think about how are we establishing contributions to have so that we can have stable contribution increases over the long term to offset the irregular expenditures that we know are going to be happening out in the future. We can then look to this report, which is from the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. The report is titled from 2022, and it's titled Longevity of Infrastructure, Reserving and Risk Management in Condominium Maintenance in Canada. It is very specific to what we are talking about tonight. I think this one paragraph is great, so I'm just going to read it here. The identification of common elements can be easily accomplished by an expert, but the cost of replacing them in the future will be harder to predict, as some common elements are to be replaced 10, 20, 30, and sometimes 60 years later. The major issue is to forecast the expected cost of those common elements in the future with the intention of contributing the right amount to the reserve fund each year until the repairs or replacements are due. So it's validating for me as somebody who spends my days trying to accurately forecast these things, just to have somebody acknowledge the challenge that we face in trying to identify what those costs are going to look like. The key chart that I wanted to share here is this one. So it compares the expenditure cost, which is this top orange and blue line. So the orange line is for rural areas, and the dark blue line is for urban areas. That's the cost of expenditures from your reserve fund. In light blue is average salaries, and in yellow is the consumer price index, which is what we hear most about in the news. So two things to notice. One is costs are rising faster than inflation you read about. So this has been happening for 20 years in this document, and certainly prior to that. And there hasn't been a trade war ongoing, or there hasn't always been the same economic challenge. There's been a variety of challenges over the years. What we can see is that this looks a lot more stable than the previous graph. Previous graph shows a lot of uncertainty, but that's over the short term. But again, when we're talking reserve fund planning, we need to be thinking about the long term as well. And so we can take some peace of mind that even though we do think that it's going to outpace consumer price inflation, it will do so with much more stability over that long term. As we've been going through this process of following the news, I'll say one quote stood out to me from Linda Hassenfratz. She's the CEO of Linamar from Guelph. And she said, don't make long-term strategy decisions based on short-term tactics. And I think that resonates in this scenario as well, because we need to be careful not to overreact to an immediate circumstance when we're talking about long-term planning. So long-term, the data tells us we can plan for smoother economic conditions over that long term and make decisions based on that. But what about the short term? So what about the projects that are planned in the next 5 years of your reserve fund study, or projects that are actively, beginning to deteriorate? You're starting to see some performance issues. How do we handle that? And that's what we're going to get into next. We're going to start talking about project planning, and I look forward to having some discussion here with Rob and John as we get into this. The first thing I want to say about project planning is, should we check the Q&A first here before we move on from reserves, or someone just wave their arms at me if I need to stop?
Caitlin and I were just checking, and yeah,
okay, perfect.
You're good to keep going.
Okay, so on to project planning, we just want to hit some highlights here. So just because it's a time of uncertainty doesn't mean you pause everything. If If anything, this is a time for condo boards to be proactive and not to be reactive. We saw this with the COVID-19 pandemic. Lots of boards paused, held back, and delayed their projects. Contractors, again, Rob and John can validate, but were hungrier for work at those times and then now have since been flooded. And now I think what we're seeing is some boards are hesitating again, or they have been in recent months, and it's sort of starting to come back. But it's not a time to pause everything. It's a time to continue moving forward. And we may get into this a little bit, but consider the actual cost risk to your project when we're talking specifically about tariffs. So we've had boards push back and say we're going to we're going to hold off on the project because of the tariff uncertainty. And I've sort of had to nudge them and say, do the tariffs actually apply to this product, these materials? We should look into that. We should look at what is the actual cost risk from a tariff perspective versus what's the cost risk from an inflation perspective or from a labor cost increase perspective, et cetera. So some key takeaways for project planning. First is stick to the fundamentals. So base your budgets on what is known today. Don't guess. Don't try to time the market. Make the best decision you can and rely on the best information available, then adjust as needed. Second takeaway is to update your reserve fund study more frequently, especially if you're facing big projects or if there are several near-term projects. So you don't have to wait for the 3-year timeline to update your reserve fund study. You can update it every year if you so choose. But certainly when you're facing a big project or something has failed sooner than planned, or you're proceeding with a project and it's going to cost a lot more than you expected it to, that's high time to update your reserve fund study. And relatively speaking, reserve fund studies are cheap, but they provide great value. They're inexpensive, but they provide great value in terms of what is the impact on the bigger picture and how do we make sure we're not harming our future by proceeding with a project today. Third is to review project timelines. So in some cases, advancing a project forward might help avoid future price hikes, but in other cases, it might make sense to delay. So you need to review that on a case-by-case basis. It's not a one-size-fits-all. You need to figure out how whichever strategy you choose is going to align with your overall financial strategy. Next is evaluate alternative options, which is what other materials are available. Some boards have been saying we want to buy Canadian, so we need to talk to Rob and John about what that might look like, and make sure that you're not compromising quality as well by adjusting the material selection. Next is to prioritize communication with owners. So owners have the same questions you have about what's going to happen, how are we managing this. So just keep them informed what the board is watching, what you're doing, who you're engaging with, that you're working with your professional team and following their advice, and that you're a steady hand on the rudder of your corporation. Certainly, displaying panic is not going to drive engagement there. And lastly, engage industry professionals. And so that's for tendering, budgets, scheduling, working with contractors and suppliers to understand how the tariffs might impact their project, retendering work if materials or services need to change, if the contract conditions allow for it. I think the bottom line here is to stay the course. So similar to past economic uncertainties like the COVID-19 pandemic, attempting to time the market can result in higher costs and project delays. And the best approach is just to remain informed, stick to the well-established project planning principles that we're all familiar with, and make strategic adjustments as you need to. As projects are moving forward as well, and you've already sort of got projects on the go, you're going to start dealing with all kinds of other issues like supply chain issues. And maybe here I'll sort of look to Rob to take over and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that they're seeing.
There, I found the mic. I'm a boomer, so all of this is quite new to me, so bear with me here. Couple of things. Firstly and foremostly, I am not a global market economist, so temper your expectations accordingly. Secondly, I've got a bit of a cold and allergies, so please excuse my hoarse sounding voice. Some things I would echo that Stefan mentioned, and I'll get into those towards the end. But I would start off by saying that, globally speaking, the US tariffs are obviously having an impact across all market segments. In my opinion, those will have more of an impact on the new construction market as opposed to the repair and restoration market where we swim in. I can say that from experience because I've lived through a few of these market softenings over the years, and typically our restoration and repair market usually stays pretty steady through those downturns. What we find often is labor becomes more available, so employees that are being laid off in the new construction market kind of flood the market, and so we find that labor is more readily available, and hiring becomes a little bit easier. And you can also find when the construction market softens a little bit, we also actually find pricing becomes a little bit more competitive as well. John, Stefan, I don't know if you guys have seen it, Stefan in the bidding process, and John maybe in tendering. We've actually seen things become more competitive. More and more companies are vying for the work a little harder right now than say, last year or the year before. So you might actually find that it's a good time to tender a project, because you might find that numbers are coming in a bit more competitively. I've certainly seen that in our tendering process this year for sure. So in terms of the possibility of tariffs having a real impact on our market, in my opinion, I don't really see that happening until the Canadian response, until Canada responds with counter or retaliatory tariffs specific to the construction industry or our market with materials that we use quite often. So we saw that when COVID happened. And if you noticed the graphs that Stefan brought up, there was a spike in 2018, 2019, 20. Those, I believe, Stefan, if I'm not mistaken, those were all related to COVID pricing, I would call it, where materials became less available, and material pricing hikes were the result. And so I can see that having an impact in terms of material pricing on incoming materials from the US to us that Canada might choose to impose tariffs on or retaliatory tariffs. Materials such as raw metals, aluminum, coatings, all the coatings that we use, stucco, cement products, new construction materials such as siding, hardy plank, it just goes across the board. Windows, supplies, vinyls, plastics, any kind of raw goods or materials that are manufactured in the US, if Canada starts to impose tariffs on those, then we will definitely see an impact on our goods here in Canada as we purchase those materials. Haven't seen that yet. I have reached out several times to a bunch of our suppliers to see where they're at, what they're expecting, what they're seeing. And at this point, everyone's telling us to stand by. We'll keep you posted, but no, we haven't seen any any price increases just yet. So take that, with a grain of salt. Could it happen? Yes, but we're not seeing it just yet. In terms of the supply chain, again, I would use COVID as an example. We went through a period where we were alerted by a bunch of our suppliers of incoming material hikes, and we were given the opportunity to pre-purchase and load up on stock, which we took advantage of in certain segments of the market. So we were actually able to, when we tendered projects and quoted jobs, at the height of it, we were able to offer better rates because we had the product in stock. And so, that's one possibility that we would look at again if we see supply chain becoming an issue. We have alerted our clients that we work with regularly to consider if they're on the fence on whether they want to move ahead with a job or not. We've encouraged them to lock in the price now while they can. And so, if they can issue us a PO, we can issue a PO to the supplier and say, hey, we want to lock this price in. And quite often they're happy to do that. If they know they have a sale, they'll set aside the material, we give them a PO, and good to go. And so I would say keep that in mind if you are considering waiting, but you are looking at a job that is coming down the rail. I would strongly recommend you really consider about not waiting, but issuing that PO and getting those numbers locked in as soon as you can, to avoid that. I know for the little bit of reading that I've done, I know that Canada is at this time trying to resist impacting the construction market with retaliatory tariffs, because that will have a pretty significant impact on the economy. And so, they're really, I think the response is to really try and keep the construction end of it out of the firing line as much as possible. So that's good as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I would say, in some of my because I don't want to drag on here and leave lots of other people to have an opportunity to say things here, but I would say I would kind of echo what Stefan said. Really, to me, the most important thing in my approach, what I value, is building relationships with our clients. I think that's really important, and I think that that's what I've tried to do in my career with, Casey. I know when you started back at Mailer Management, that was a long time ago. So and we,
Rob, you're giving my age away. What are you doing?
Sorry. But what I'm trying to say, when I look at the names across the board here, there's a bunch of you that I know. I think that what's important is for as boards and as property managers, that you build relationships with your contractors, with the contractors that you trust, with your consultants that you trust. We're here. Talk to us. You don't just have to talk to us when there's a job that you have to quote. Like if there's something that you want to run by us, run it by us. We're here. This is what we do. We love talking about what we do, and all at the end of the day, we love helping you make decisions that are good decisions or wise decisions that will have a good impact on the longevity of your buildings, right? So when it comes to these kind of times that we're in, I think it's important to have good relations with your contractors, with your consultants. Trust them. We're not all rat bags, right? So, don't be afraid to reach out and ask, right? And weigh that into your Google searches when you're looking at this stuff as well, right? So, we're kind of at the tip of the spear of what's going on out there. So you have a resource that's that's available to you. So yeah, make use of that. And I would say also, I think that what should guide your decision on whether or not you should proceed with the project is really, again, listen to your contractor, listen to your consultant, and really what needs to be at the forefront is your building, your property. What are the priorities? What really needs to happen now and what can wait? And there are people that can help you make those decisions and plan out those actions for your building. And that's what I think should motivate you on making decisions whether or not you should move now or hold. Really, what's the right thing for your building. Yeah.
I think that's really good, Rob. And I actually came up with a thought as we're sitting here, all of us, and I'm gonna ask each of you to kind of touch on this, and then John, we're gonna kind of move into you. But so all of you work with condos all of the time. So we're talking about, should we wait on projects or should we go ahead? Stefan, from a consultant point of view, and you're sending out bids, what are start dates looking like? Like how are you getting quotes? Because I mean, we can talk about the tariffs now, but Rob, like how far are you booking out? John, how far are you booking out, right? Because are tariffs going to be affecting ongoing projects or projects that are already booked? Or are we looking at projects a year from now, 18 months from now? Stefan, you start, and then Rob, and then John, and then John, you can lead into your topics on how you think about that as well. Stefan?
Thanks, Casey. Yeah, we just want to echo one thing that Rob was saying about, it's a good time to proceed with work because contractors are looking for that work. And I was going to say that. I was sort of waiting for one of you guys to say it first. It makes more sense coming from you, but that's certainly been evidenced in our conversations with contractors and what we've seen through the sharpening of pencils during tender process. So competitive pricing is coming in quite competitively. Contractors, good contractors, two of which are on this call, have availability for some work, which is always exciting for us when we'll be able to do some work this year with Brick & Co. and Armor Co. that we didn't have to tender in the fall. When getting on these guys' schedules sometimes is challenging because they're popular, they do good work, so it can be challenging. But we're seeing a bit of a different landscape this year. But you guys can tell me if I'm off the mark or if you're seeing it as well.
Yeah, I think
Right.
if I'm next in line, yeah. I think a lot of you are used to us saying, sorry, we can't do it right now, or I see Casey's nodding her head. She's heard that a few times from me. We're often at this time of year, we're often booking into next year and beyond. That's not the case this year at all. I would say we have 3 crews right now that are looking for their big anchor job still. We're filling in with small jobs. So we've seen a very competitive market right now, extremely competitive. Jobs that we would ordinarily land quite easily, we're not landing right now. And so what we're keeping quite busy with is we've got a few anchor jobs on the go, but we're responding fairly quickly to the smaller mid-sized jobs. And so we've got availability. Like I say, we've got 3 crews 3 or 4 crews that we could book in still in the summer, which is very unusual for us. Very, very, very unusual for us. So we're definitely seeing it. And Stefan, if I could ask you, are you seeing from a tendering perspective, are you seeing numbers like I don't know if you compare year to year when you're, and I know every tender is different because they have just different scopes, but in general, when you're looking at unit prices, are you seeing them come down a little or softening?
It's difficult to say at that level, but I would say that it's absolutely nothing like the COVID-19 situation where we were getting shocked at the prices that were coming in. Like prices are coming in on or below budget. We've had a few that were like quite a bit below budget, and we're sort of going, oh, we can proceed with some optional items and still be within what we had planned, which is unusual because last time we had all this economic uncertainty, it was going the other way, right? These prices were coming in really highly elevated, but right now we have uncertainty without the actual cost coming. And so the uncertainty is causing corporations to pause, and it's creating more opportunity for those that are being proactive to take advantage. Yeah.
So, John, just before you jump in there, Stefan, so we're hearing, okay, Rob has room. We don't know what John has yet, but if a board decides, after listening tonight, hey, okay, we don't want to hold off on this project. We want to get moving. What's the timeline on getting the spec put together and the bid together, right? Because they have room, but when are we going to get that information? Because, I mean, boards meet once a month, maybe. Often not a lot in the summer. Like it is changing the landscape fully for everyone, right? So
Yeah, the requests have been coming fast and furious.
okay.
But I think that how I would answer that question is like how we manage our workflow and our team. We would love to have our labor market be what Rob's is, where there's just all kinds of people
Me
um,
too. I would like that
ready to
too.
jump on board. Yeah, I think that'd be great. But we triage in a sense, right? Like our construction season's the same as these guys, and so we want to try to support as many corporations as we can in executing work. And so we are open with our communication with boards that are, looking at a window system to try to decide if it's a 5 years from now or a 10 years from now project. We're sort of saying, look, can we do this in the fall? Because, does that impact you in any way? Do you need the numbers now for some reason? Because if not, then, we're going to prioritize some of this more temperature sensitive, more urgent work. And by and large, corporations are open to that. They appreciate the open communication about timelines. But like I got a call today, and again, triaging, but there's a retaining wall that's actively falling down and needs braced. And so sure, ideally we would push them out into the future, but that's not an option. And so away we go, when we make it work. Yeah,
Perfect.
I think,
J-
sorry, just to tag on there, my ask, like when you're reaching out, the ask is just to be clear with what your timing expectations are so that we can make sure that everybody's expectations are aligned going in. Because the last thing we want to do is not meet expectations. And so understanding what your objectives are, being very upfront about what that looks like and the risks of getting it done or not getting it done this year versus what it might look like to plan for spring. um, just the clarity of expectations is always helpful.
Awesome. And John, we're looking forward to your thoughts. And I think you should be able to cover one of these questions that just came up in the chat as well about with import tariffs set to decrease goods moving into the US, is the possibility that our other countries are trying to increase goods sold to other countries like Canada. So, and I know you have some insight on that one for us as well. So,
Yeah, so I'll just echo Stefan and Rob's comments regarding competition. Yeah, competition is fierce. It's as competitive out there as I've ever seen it. And as far as price increases, there's always price increases, but we're seeing. I'll give you an example. The Waterford was a double tower that we refurbished on the lakefront, and our budget pricing to the corporation when we pitched the project 2 years ago, they added a bunch of things. They added the lobbies, they added the P levels, but the corridor component after it was designed basically came in at the same price point 2 years later, right? So that speaks to the fact that suppliers are staying steady. This, main components being carpet, wall covering, lighting, but it also speaks to how competitive all our subtrades are, where installation costs didn't go up very much at all over 2 years. Now, with I can speak directly to that question. And I'll just stick with the interior common element point of view. European carpet suppliers are actively looking to do business in Canada. I'm dealing with Materialize, and Lisa used to work for another supplier, has gone out on her own and is scrambling. Like, I mean, looking to hire. Her business is growing at such a pace she can't keep up. European suppliers have found an opportunity. They're here. Their price points are very, very similar. Logistically, getting samples and take a little longer, and they're not set up right now to produce large scale samples. So you're just getting 3x3 pieces of carpet versus being able to show a client a 6-foot piece. But yeah, they're actively trying to break into this market. Wall covering is another component. A lot of UK and European suppliers are trying to break into the market. The problem with them is their price point's high. So you end up being in the same place, just paying the tariff as, using a European product. And I'll just kind of roll into one of the questions was, and basically we've all talked about it. Should we bring things forward? As far as interior refurbishments go, in a really simplistic way, everything's going to cost a little bit more next year. You're looking at supplier increases that happen yearly, labor increases that, we take into account every couple of years. With interior refurbishments, costs change with currency exchanges. Like carpet and wall covering are all bought in American dollars. So like right now, our dollar's doing a little bit better than it was 6 months ago. Another component as far as refurbishments go about bringing something forward, because I'm in the middle of it right now with another project, where the reserve fund has certain components spread out over several years, right? So they have an a lighting retrofit out 10 years, but they're doing their corridors. So for us to do wall covering, we have to remove their lights, their sconces, pack them in bubble wrap, box them, store them, remove all the wall covering, do the project, and at the end, reinstall that fixture. So, and they're ugly fixtures, and they're not very efficient fixtures. And the idea that they're going to pay for the labor to get new lights. The only thing they're not paying for is the fixture itself, just to do wall covering. So the board and the manager are looking to move that forward and see whether they can make that work, because it makes sense to do the lights now. It's the same thing. We run into some projects sometimes with boards. We don't want to do any wall covering. We don't want to do any painting. We just want to do the carpet. Those items are out 3 years. Now they're putting themselves in a situation where they're going to do a bunch of messy work over top of $100,000 worth of carpet they bought 2 years ago, right? Where just the way the project comes together, it doesn't make sense. Carpet's the last thing that goes in, not the first thing. So so those considerations have to be taken into account, regardless of tariffs and regardless of inflation. Is you got a project that your ownership might be very hungry for because you've been talking about it for years. Are you really going to put it off because there's a threat of tariffs, or are you going to break it up into pieces to try and stay with your reserve fund without coming up with some solutions to actually do the project? If financially you can't do it, that's the time where you actually push a project off. If you can't do component A, B, and C in one project, then you wait until you can, because it makes absolutely no sense doing it in pieces. Tariffs. So carpet falls under CUSMA. So as long as the company's American, as long as the nylon is extruded in the States, um, and I think there's another piece to it. And the actual carpet is manufactured in the US, obviously. It falls under Kuzma. There are no tariffs. So we're doing a project in Hamilton. It's $1.8 million, 33 floors. What we ended up doing with them was the two American items that we knew we couldn't get around because the project was designed. So we weren't just going to blow up the design and waste the 7 months we just worked with them to come up with new carpets, new wall covering. What we simply did was we didn't know what the future held, so we just budgeted a contingency that would cover those tariffs. The overall supply hit, if tariffs were applicable, was going to be just under $50,000. So on a $1.8 million project, it's a lot of money, but it's something that's manageable. And what ended up happening in that case was, carpet wasn't applicable, so no tariffs on that. And with the wall covering, we had the supplier come to the table and they picked up half the tariff. So the overall hit wasn't very significant to the corporation. Yeah, I think that's kind of it for me. The one thing about locking in prices, it's always a great idea to get POs out because as contractors, that's the only way we can guarantee that your light or your carpet or your wall covering or your door hardware is going to be what we quoted you a few months ago. But the nasty thing about tariffs is that doesn't matter because if the product hits the border and Canada has retaliated, those tariffs are applicable. Your PO doesn't mean anything at that point, right? It's a negotiation with your supplier, but they're getting hit with that expense and they're going to try and pass it along.
Yeah, I would jump in to just quickly give our take on and the CCDC contract provides protections to the contractors in those situations, not to the corporations. If there are, unforeseen, very real costs at that magnitude, then that's not something that the corporation can be protected by under the Construction Act. So certainly something to be aware of. But I want to pick up on something John said, if Casey doesn't mind me jumping in here. Just about what is the real cost of tariffs? Because I've found that corporations or boards have been sort of saying, we have this $1 million project, so this 25% tariff is going to cost us $250,000, and that's just not it. Materials are, first of all, there's no tariffs on labor, that to my knowledge, and materials, guys can tell me if I'm right or wrong here, sort of 30 to 50% typically, maybe 70% for window projects. And depending where the material is coming from, tariffs might not apply on everything. So your real cost might be, somewhere under $100,000, could be 50,000, say. But that's 5% inflation. So that's waiting until next year and experiencing material and labor inflation on the whole project price anyway. And so just evaluating what the real impact is going to be and getting into the nitty gritty that John and Rob have been talking about. So like aluminum windows, 80% of the aluminum in North America is produced in Quebec. So it doesn't have to cross the border because it's extruded here. The coatings come from Texas, but they're applied here. So you pay a tariff on the 3% of the window cost, which is the coatings. The glass comes from the States, doesn't come from Canada, the float glass, but hasn't been tariffed yet. But that would be a significant chunk, about half the cost of the windows. But you need to get into that level to understand what the tariff impact is. And our experience is that it's often in line with a normal construction contingency anyway. So it's not some major curveball that's getting thrown at your project. It should already be planned for in some capacity in your reserve fund study. Yes, it's an additional cost that you need to consider. It increases risk, but it's often not the doomsday scenario that I sort of get the sense a lot of boards think it is.
Mhm. And to follow up with that, I think it's important that boards understand, and Rob spoke to it earlier, talk to your consultant, talk to a contractor you trust, what's actually going to cost you more. Because, I get the sense out there that somebody threw out that 25% number and they're just adding 25% to like everything, right? We had a board, a large siding project, and we didn't know whether Hardy board was going to be part of the next batch of tariffs Canada was going to put up against the States. They were so panicky about it. They paid a $200,000 startup invoice before the CCDC was signed. And we were just like, we knew them, they knew us. Um, so, but it was still the kind of the craziest thing I had seen, just for us to get all our material in Canada before something that never happened might happen.
I think that's really good points is yeah, it's kind of very fearful, right? The monster in the closet, that darkness, like what is it actually? And I think you guys are all right, working with contractors who you trust, who you know, who you're able to have a conversation with, consultants who you know and trust and are able to have a conversation with and break down exactly what the tariff is going to affect, right? Is there products that we know the tariffs are definitely impacting at, say, a high rate? I'm thinking particularly, both of you have experience in this, sealants or caulking, because a lot of that is directly based out of the US, right? Is there a product that we know if you're doing this project, if you're doing project X, you're going to see a bigger increase than what we've just been talking about?
I can jump in on that. Everything we've priced so far for the materials that we use, we have not seen any price increases yet.
And we're operating at the same price model we got from our sealant suppliers late last year. So
That's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
That's good
So
news. Yeah.
I mean, I think we just got our pricing from Tremco Canada, for example. Haven't seen anything from Dow, but from Tremco Canada, and they've just got their normal yearly or annual price increases, but nothing that's tariffs related. We specifically asked the question. Tremco Canada does have a few products in their lineup that is impacted by tariffs, but nothing within our community for the work that we're doing, right? So if I could get back to Terrence's question, if you don't mind, Casey, because there's a couple things I
Absolutely.
wanted to point out, and I think John kind of touched on it as well. Terrence, shout out if you are who I think you are. How you doing? The like the question about opening up other markets it's a fair and good question. Something that you got to realize is that all of these products that we work with, all the infrastructure's there. So for perhaps John has access to some materials markets that he can kind of take a look at in other countries. But certainly with the types of products that we work with, they're like for example, I get hit up, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 times a year with a new product, right? Silicones, for example, some brand new company will show up and say, hey, do you want to? And I'm like, no, I don't want to put your silicone on any of our buildings because it's not tried and proven. I'd rather go to a company that's been putting it down for the last 50, 60 years, or I don't even know, probably longer than that. It's so that's something that you gotta weigh cost benefit, right? That's really important when you're looking at that. That's not to say that there may be some products out there that John, for example, may have access to that works with his market, but certainly in the exterior envelope market, the U.S. has that fairly well sewn up in terms of coatings and raw materials like what they use for polyurethanes and silicones. And so that's something to consider. And the other point that John made as well is I think really valid. Some of these years, there are some European product offerings out there that we can use, but they're typically more money. anyway. And they have a really tough time at competing with kind of like the North American price point. So that's something to consider as well, right? And the other thing is with a lot of these products that are coming from overseas, you just don't, are they drawing from in terms of the chain of manufacturing, some of those items are going to be hitting the US anyway. And so it all gets kind of complicated and factored in ways that we don't even maybe realize. And so, yeah, I would say perhaps the opportunity is there to look at new markets. I think we should be open to that, but I also think we should be careful when we're looking at that against, history, what's tried and proven, what's really going to work the best, for your project.
Yeah, and to follow up with that, same here. I would never install sealants on a high-rise envelope that isn't, you know, something that's coming from Tremco, something that's coming from Dow, and something that's been specified by a consultant. Because we're not molecular engineers, so we can't break down what this sealant is really kind of made up, and that's something that we can't do. What we can do on the interior side, as far as refurbishments goes, is I can look at carpet weight, I can look at stitch per inch, I can look at the tar value, and those three items I can compare them with carpet coming out of Georgia and know whether I'm getting something as good and if not better, right? And the same thing with wall covering. It's vinyl. I'm just concerned with the backing and the weight of the product, and it's not rocket science to compare apples to apples. When you're talking about coatings and sealants, that's real science, and we're not in a position to say, yeah, we think it's about the same, and then have a failure, 2 years later.
All very valid points. Thank you so much. I think what I'm taking from this is, yes, tariffs, again, do your homework and understand where it's affecting your project, and that will help you determine what impact it's having. I do want to touch on the fact that we talked about the fact that there's room that contractors have today. And I don't know that it's all tariff related, and maybe you guys can speak to this as well. Are we thinking this is happening because of the slowdown of new build condominiums that are happening because they aren't being sold as quickly, like from the housing market, since we've talked about all of that? And as a result of that, because the Toronto area tends to have, the biggest reports of this definite decline in condo sales. And so are we seeing more GTA contractors coming our way? What, again, totally different discussion, but I think it's relevant to doing large projects. And when we put tariffs on top of it, like, is this why we're seeing the labor force? Is this why we're seeing some openings? Like, I'm just gonna put it out there and see what you guys think.
I know that Stefan's going to have something to say on this. I'll just be real quick.
Of course.
For us, strictly working in the condo space, and especially with interior projects where the design portion could be, 6 months, a corporation's RFP process could be 6 months. We build our year out by forecasting because boards take a long time to make decisions about big projects. It's not, especially in the design build scenario, it's not like they've hired a consultant who's putting together a specification, putting it out to tender, getting multiple quotes, setting a start date, and it's getting in a year. To put it in perspective, we update our booking rates over a 2-year period because the sales cycle can be that long. So as far as we know with forecasting, it's going to be a busy year, and tariffs haven't affected anything.
Stefan, you got any comments or thoughts on this one?
Well, I'm of two minds about the Toronto contractor comment. There are only a couple local contractors that do great work for condominiums, and they're on this call. So you can't just invite two contractors to bid. And so inevitably, our experience anyway is that other competent contractors, we need to draw from other areas. And maybe they're based in Toronto, but they have crews or foremen that live here, or even London way we've seen. And so I can't say that I've picked up on that trend specifically, but I think that it's important, like when you're going through a tendering process, first of all, if I didn't emphasize it earlier, if you are looking to get some work done this year, then you need to move quickly to jump on it. I said that we can accommodate, but there is a point at which we cannot accommodate supporting getting those projects done. But you want to, like best practice for tendering, gauge interest with the contractors. You want your consultant to understand which contractors are looking for work and have crews available, right? You want to make sure that those are the ones you're inviting to bid on the project. Even if Rob, despite having great crews, if they don't have a crew available this year, we're probably not going to get as competitive a price. And so we need to be mindful of that as we carry out our tendering process. But then at the end of the day, when you get the pricing's apples to apples. That's the whole point of a professionally tendered scope of work and tender process. So you can proceed confidently with whoever was the lowest bidder, right? If they've all been pre-qualified, it doesn't matter whether they're local or from somewhere else. It comes down to the nuts and bolts of your financial situation. So that's sort of our experience on it, I guess.
Good point. Rob, you got some
Yeah, I
comments
can
on
weigh
this
in a
one?
little bit. I kind of break it up into two market segments. So we have definitely seen. So let me back up here. As I said before, I've lived through several of these kind of construction softening markets over the years. And what's I think different this time around is we're seeing a much greater influx from the outside of our region, right? So we're seeing bidders or contractors traveling farther afield and still pricing competitively on bids. Whereas before, we could easily beat out a Toronto-based contractor, but they're starting to set up satellite offices, in our region, in London and beyond, and just becoming more and more competitive. So, in specifically this year, I would say, and part of last year, we have most certainly seen on the big tendered projects, we're fighting a lot harder to get those jobs. Whereas in years past, we could kind of cherry pick and say, we really want this one, and we get it. That's not really the case right now. There's been a number of projects that were just like really in our wheelhouse and I really wanted, and we're coming up second, third, fairly routinely. The flip side, we have been very busy with our privately negotiated smaller and mid-sized jobs. And I think we're successful at those just because of the relationships that we've established over the decades within the condo community in our region, right? And so, and so we've been able to service that market, I would say, a little bit better this year, but because we have a bit more availability, so we've been able to respond a little bit better. And so we've been busy in that segment, which is great, but we're still looking to kind of get more of our anchor jobs that we are typically used to getting. So that, to me, the availability for the is in large part due to the new construction market softening, less builds happening. It's flooded our restaurant. So what happens is these companies, they need work to make payroll, and so they're looking for other sources of revenue, and so they kind of migrate into our market, and then when things pick up in the new market, they go back out into the new market again, right? And so we kind of see that ebb and flow. I have seen that, over and over again, and we're seeing that right now.
All excellent points. Thank you, guys. We did get an interesting question, I think, that says, do you think there will be a cross-provincial border opportunities in building rather than just going to the US? Will we see more provincial trading as opposed to US Canadian trading? Who would like to take that one on?
I need an economist tonight.
You are. You are.
I think um, in general, removing trade barriers should drive prices down.
Mhm.
That's the extent of my economic expertise. And I know
Do we
that our
think
Prime
that's
Minister has
something we'll
indicated
see?
that will happen by Canada Day. So,
Wow. Wow, cool.
like he said that this week, because it's only been, yeah, but that announcement was made that provincial trade barriers are coming down by Canada Day. And so I'm not sure the specific impact of that. I don't know if Rob or John has anything else to add there. Seeing not, I'll jump in on one other tariff item I wanted to touch on, which is sort of related, but
Yeah.
it took me a minute to pull up here. So this was from December, but it was a letter that Gentech sent out to consultants and contractors they work with. And it basically says, like, Gentech is facing inflationary pressures, including a 25% tariff on aluminum products from China. So not a Canada-US thing, but just a global economic forces issue. But so your vinyl siding project, went up, the material went up by 8% from last year to this year. The aluminum products went up 13%. So when we're talking about those graphs I showed earlier about the volatility and things going up faster than normal inflation, this is a prime example of global pressures that manifest in a very clear way. And this happens every year. We get some of these letters from, I remember getting one from Tremco, a scary one from Tremco during the pandemic. I'm sure you guys received the same, where it was like, those numbers weren't 13% and 8%, it was like 50%. And we're all sort of going, what's happening here?
No,
So
those
it's
excellent.
always been happening is my point.
Exactly. And I think that's it. I do want to touch on it again, and I know it's repetitive, but definitely seeing the actual impact of the tariff on your project, working with you guys to understand that makes the most sense, not just making the assumption of the 25%. Right?
Yeah.
We did have a bit of a follow-up on the sealants question, which I'm going to introduce now, that says, do you think there's a risk companies in the US change their formulas, like on sealants, because of the input substitutions, like substitutions for cost reduction reasons?
I can take that one.
Sure,
Yeah.
Rob.
Yeah. So I mean, I can give you real examples. I would say that I think these types of companies are always looking at cost, cost reduction measures, right? But they're for the most part loath to put out products that aren't tested because they expose themselves to liabilities. That's not to say they don't do that. I've had a number of situations where I won't say who, but a particular manufacturer that was was established in the restoration market and said, hey, we got this, try this out, and it was a colossal failure. I've had that happen more than once, I would say, and they've always been good to work with me to to rectify it. But another thing that I've noticed is with the pressure to make products more environmentally friendly, that can also sometimes have an impact on their performance. And so you got to weigh that out as well. A great example I can give you is I was installing traffic code, and I don't know, John, how far you go back, but Mamico, I don't know if you remember Mamico, which is now Tremco bought out Vulcan Tremco. used to be Mimico, and I used to put Mimico down in garages, and I mean that stuff you'd get high as a kite putting it down because of the solvents. It was terrible to work with, but man, it was a good product, and it lasted forever, right? So I had garages that I put that down, and we were looking at 20-25 years of performance before we were reapplying, right? Stefan,
Even my career started before low VOC products. Like,
okay. So
yeah, it wasn't all water-based
right,
stuff that you have to
right,
reapply every 5 years. It was
right. So
like
now,
the real chemical stuff.
yeah. So now you put down a product in a turning lane after 5 years, you're seeing it wear out, right?
Yeah.
That never happened, back in the early 90s. I can tell you that for sure. So there's that as well. And then again, you got to weigh the cost benefit, right? And so I can't speak to that. I can just tell you what used to work better than now. But so that kind of, I don't know if that answers your question, Terrence. I'm sorry if it doesn't, but again, I always pull back to what's tried, tested, and proven. Don't monkey around with that. Be open to new stuff, but I have a much more conservative approach when it comes to those types of things. So that's my take on it.
I think importantly though, they didn't change the formula and call it the same thing. So they may introduce like a discounted product, knowing that if the Tremco Daimonics of the world or the Spec 2s of the world suddenly become very, very expensive, they may introduce a less expensive product line, but they wouldn't change the formula of those products that are branded. If they did, it would ruin their reputation very
Very
quickly, in
true.
my opinion. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just so everyone's aware, Stefan has put into the chat all of the charts and reports that he has referenced through the presentation. So you're welcome to pull them out of the chat if you're interested in some bedtime reading, for sure. We do have a question, not tariff related, but reserve fund related, and an important question for boards to understand. Stefan, this one's probably going to be for you. But it is, can a board be liable for not doing a condo project during the reserve fund study recommended period, i.e. a project was recommended to be done in 3 years, but it didn't get done?
So not a lawyer, ask a lawyer for liability questions. And the lawyer answer would be, it depends. So let's walk through a couple examples here. Like if your reserve fund studies included a repair allowance for the sidewalks and the sidewalks don't need to be repaired and you don't spend the money, the risk of liability there is very, very low, I would say. If the reserve fund study planned for roof replacement in 3 years, but the roofs are, you don't have leaks, and you don't replace the roofs, I would find a hard time finding what you'd be liable for in that case. I think when it comes to the short-term projects, it's about relying on more than the reserve fund study. So as a board of directors or as individual board members, you're obligated under the Condominium Act to maintain a standard of care. And part of that includes relying on and following the advice of professionals. So if a reserve fund study indicates, hey, your roofs are nearing the end of their service life, you're starting to experience some leaks, we should do a condition assessment and identify what the risks are, pros and cons of doing the work now versus deferral. And the report comes out and says, we recommend replacing your roofs this year because of all of these reasons of increased costs, health risks from ongoing leaks, whatever it might be. And you choose not to replace the roofs. Yeah, they're probably more exposed than in another circumstance. What I would say is that my non-lawyer gut on this is, if an engineer is serious about something needing to get done such that liability would apply, they are going to communicate that to you very clearly and not just in the reserve fund study report. They will be banging on your door, issuing stamped letters, reports, emails, calling the city. Like that's our duty of care under the Professional Engineers Act. So I think when you're talking about following a reserve fund study, first of all, you will never follow a reserve fund study perfectly. Please don't try to. Set your budgets, follow your budgets. The reserve fund study is intended to try to put the right amount of money in the ballpark of where projects should be happening. And in that first 5 years, you're trying to dial it in as much as possible. But you need to be lining up those condition assessments, spec packages, tendering processes before you modify that 3 to 5 year plan for anything of significance. I hope that answered your question, Cam. Happy to.
I wish we had a lawyer on the panel, because it's a question, it's a
Said
question that
nobody
I get.
ever.
It's a question I get all the time. Like, I mean, I would say, you know, 60-70% of boards that I work with on interior projects feel that they have a legal obligation to follow the reserve fund. So they have $300,000 for this project, and they are under the impression that they cannot spend a dollar more than what's in the reserve fund. And I don't believe that that's true, because I've experienced enough projects where things are added and they want to go in a different direction, or they want to take care of an area now that's not due for a couple of years. But a lot of boards feel that way or think that way.
It's very true. It's tough because, we rely on, an owner, an offsite owner of a condominium unit to make up a portion of a board, maybe not within their skill set, maybe within their skill set. Some take that responsibility, black and white to a T, which is the board members who we hear, think that the reserve fund is set in stone and have to follow it exactly. And good on them. They're doing it with best of intentions, right? Because they're trying to fulfill their duty as a board member absolutely correctly and in the most positive light. Then we have others who don't necessarily follow that same path. So it's always a tough call. What is the right decision, right? And I don't know that even a lawyer can provide the right decision for that. The right decision, I think, is to fix the components that need to be fixed when they need to be fixed, and do your reserve fund study every 3 years, if not more often, to make sure that you're on the right path. Stefan?
Well, the crazy part is it goes the other way too. Some boards get lots of backlash from owners for proceeding with projects where it's planned in the reserve fund study, it's justified from a financial and engineering performance perspective in the professional opinion of the consultant. And owners will say, my windows are fine. It's like, well, other people's are leaking. The costs have risen exponentially, and you are bound by the Condominium Act, this framework, which you are required to follow, or your board members are required to follow. And people sort of lose sight of that. So it's a thankless job, newsflash, to be a board member. But hopefully your professionals can defend you regardless of whichever situation you're in.
Absolutely. Exactly. We are here to support. Hopefully it's not always defending, but supporting and showing that you're making the right decisions. And people like we have on the panel today are here to help you. So we're getting close to about 10 minutes left. So at this point, I'm going to ask each of you to give a takeaway from the presentation regarding tariffs, kind of your last thought or a nugget that the board members can take when they're facing a project, or maybe a fellow board member who didn't have the opportunity to attend, what they can take back to their team on tariffs and condominiums. Stefan, you want to start?
Where to go? I think I'll take the generic of, it's not necessarily business as usual, but it is stay the course. So stay the course and stay informed, do your due diligence, rely on your professionals, think critically. But I've learned tonight as well, I think there's even more opportunity to proceed this year than I had previously realized. So stay the course is what I would say.
Awesome. John?
Don't panic. I mean, don't worry about things that aren't here yet.
I think that's very true. Rob?
It's a great one.
Do more of this. Communicate, ask questions, reach out to your professionals. You know, when you have these established relationships with us, make use of it. It's a resource available to you, right? Yeah, do more of this, have some more open dialogue. Don't be afraid to chuck an email and ask questions. I think that's all good. You know, it makes for a healthy construction consultant, you know, community of whatever it is that we do here, right? You know, we're all in this together, obviously from different sides of the fence, but we're all kind of, at the end of the day, we're all kind of working together to make this all work for you know, for our buildings and for each other. So yeah, I'm going all kumbaya here, but I really think it's important. I really do.
I don't disagree, especially in a time that's just
All
full
right,
of
Stefan.
a lot of non-kumbaya moments, right? People are pretty stressed. So
Right, yeah, for
I
sure.
agree. Communicating and trying to look at it from all angles and make the best possible decision, but knowing that everyone is human too, right? None of us on this panel are economists. None of us have a crystal ball to forecast what that future is going to look like, but we all definitely give our very best in trying to come up with what's the right decision for every condo that we are part of. So thank you again for attending our session. Our next session is September 3rd. We don't have a topic yet, so if you guys have something burning that you want to see us discuss, please send it in to myself or Kathy or your PM, and we'll be sure to get something going. As far as our icebreaker questions, Stefan, his first job was cutting grass. Asked if maybe that was an actual job, but to be fair, we now call those guys landscapers. So I think it was fair to be his first actual job. John was a dishwasher and Rob was an apprentice carpenter. In Australia, actually. So I left that part out because it might have given it away. But once again, to our panel members, thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much to our board members and our management team for attending. Hope you all pulled some information from this. We will be putting the recording up onto the YouTube channel, and we'll let you know when that's up and available for everyone to look at again. So thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy. I can't believe that we're sitting in here and the sun is still out. So I'm pretty excited about that. So have a great summer, everyone, and we'll see you in September for our next session. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.